Welcome everybody. I will call our work session to order. And with that, we're going to talk about our cell phone policy, and I'll turn it over to Superintendent Degner for him to make any opening remarks and kick it to the team.
You bet. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us in our work session here. Hopefully, kind of our last work session about our cell phone policy. You also have it on the action portion of your agenda for this evening. I don't think there's any surprises in what we're presenting to you tonight. It's pretty close to what we had conversed about the last time we were together. And so what you have attached there is a little bit of a presentation and then some specifics about the policy and how it's executed, which is really based on that limited restriction focused on protecting instructional time for our staff and students. The one thing I will say, just from a process standpoint, we've been writing this policy more in terms of what would go in a student handbook type form, and so there may be an element where we want to come back to a P&G meeting and actually have something that links to an official board policy. So we haven't necessarily numbered it that way. This is, with your support tonight, this is what we would look at executing and moving forward in our buildings, but we'd probably want to codify that into policy in a little bit more formal way, and so we just bring it back through that regular process. But if later this evening you do move forward with this, then we'll turn around based on the information we share with you tonight about getting that rolling here after the first of the year. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to kind of Lucas and Brady to carry some of the heavy lift here then on explaining some things to you. And of course, we want to make sure your questions get answered. And then maybe the final thing I'll share and be quiet would be just kind of be thinking about what's appropriate for us to share again in the regular meeting. Do you want us to duplicate kind of the opening that we share with you here tonight? Do you want something more high level when we get to that meeting? I'm sure you guys will want to make some comments during the regular meeting too, but that would be helpful for us to know if you want us to deliver the same message we share here at the beginning or something abbreviated during the regular meeting. So with that, go ahead, guys.
All right, thank you again tonight. Appreciate you all. I wanted to go through kind of our main objectives here for the evening. We have a lot of details that we're going to share out again, as Superintendent Degner communicated. Should be a whole lot of surprises, but we wanted to go through more of the implementation pieces, which are a little bit different or maybe a little bit more detailed out than what we shared the last time. There's been a lot of conversations about the metrics of success, about how are we going to show that this new policy is in fact successful with our kids, and then what we see as an ideal rollout for our staff, students, and families.
I just echo what Lucas said. Just thanks. This has been a good collaborative process, and I think that's important. I think the things you're seeing from other districts don't always feel, look like that, and so I do appreciate that we have taken our time and hopefully gotten a draft policy proposal based on the work of our team that you find to be satisfactory. So we did have, just as a review, I think we all know this is maybe more for the public, but the most recent action after the November 12th board meeting, we did take some of your directions back to that work group, and we were able to meet on the 21st. The work group, as you know, has 8 secondary administrators and 8 ICEA leaders, and Lucas and I facilitated that work. They did produce the draft policy proposal that you have on board docs and in front of you tonight, based on the work that they had done previously, their analysis of different districts as well as your directives. So that's what we're going to go over tonight, and of course we'll have hopefully time for conversation as well. And I'll try through this. I think we'll both try. I think to highlight some of the things that are different if this policy were to be adopted from our current policies. I think that's an important point. All of you as a board have put in a lot of time and energy and thought and care into this topic, and we definitely heard loud and clear that there were changes that you wanted made, and so we'll try to articulate those throughout the presentation as well as at the end of the presentation as well. So if you notice, this was per request from Director Ashton. We did define instructional time. So instructional time is the time between the tardy bell that starts each class period and the dismissal bell that ends the class period. So we did include that. That is a change from current policies. There is not a definition in any of our secondary policies that look like that. Student cell phones, we took this actually from Tate High School. They used this pretty successfully. Shall not be seen, heard, or in use during instructional time. That gives us a little bit more latitude in how we're approaching the issue of cell phones, earbuds, and headphones. They need to be detached from the body. Again, that's a change in our policy. That's something that I think Director Lingo has talked about quite a bit, and so we appreciated that and took that into consideration. You'll notice on the overview, we do have a gradual release of responsibility approach with our elementary to our middle schools to our high schools. And so our elementary schools, of course, will be the most restrictive. And as we move up into our high schools, that will have fewer, they will have fewer restrictions under the proposed policy. One note, just to clarify, for our middle schools, no use of cell phones during study hall. That is a change from current policy. For our high schools, it's not noted on this slide, but it is in the language of the draft policy. Students would be allowed to use their cell phone or device during their study hall time. Students assigned lunch and passing periods are both allowed use in our middle schools and our high school under the proposed policy from the team. And then open hours in designated areas at our high schools. So that would be your juniors and seniors in your high schools. Our thought process as a team was we wanted our students, if possible, to stay on our campuses. And so that we feel like that's a better level of engagement for them. It's maybe a little bit safer for them. So that's why we did carve that into the policy and that would be almost exclusively your juniors and seniors. So I think 16, 17, and 18-year-old students would be the ones that would have an open period.
And there were some small details that we didn't necessarily think of or discuss in previous meetings that are those that are in the building, the teachers, the administrators, think through this, or have we considered this as part of the policy because this is what students will or may do or will do or are currently doing. So things like the open periods, the safety of students as much as possible staying in the building rather than giving them an excuse to leave. And also the idea of those commons that even though it may be located near a study hall, or near a hallway, a commons is a different area that students congregate, maybe different than a library or a study hall location. Again, so kids, instead of having to leave for 45 minutes and come back, have those designated areas within those buildings that they would be allowed to use their cell phones.
I think some of the success of the projects that we've had, construction projects and building out those common spaces, was definitely something the team talked about. The administrator said, we just built these amazing common spaces, they're really great for kids, and we'd like them to stay in those common spaces rather than hopping in their cars as juniors and seniors and going out to grab something at a gas station to eat. Implementation procedures, there are some differences here as well. So upon entering the classroom, all of the phones, earbuds, and headphones must be detached from the student's body. We've talked about that before as a policy change if the proposal is accepted. Ringers must be silenced. We have a couple of options. We wanted people to have some options for the destination for their device. It could be a backpack, it could be a phone, it could be a hanging pouch in a classroom if the teacher has one that they've been using, or it could be the student's assigned locker. Teachers will say your devices should be secured. That will be the only warning. That is also a change from our current policies. Depending on the secondary school that you're talking about currently, there could be a series of warnings that take place. This will be the only warning. We expect the teachers to be in the hallways, monitoring the hallways and greeting students as they come into our room, building relationships. That's a very important skill for a teacher to develop. It's a great way to help your students feel confident and comfortable coming into your classroom. So that's where the teachers are expected to be during passing period, is out in the hallway doing hallway duty and greeting students. When they then come back into and we want our students to come into our classrooms. We don't want them looping around the Whipple Square of Liberty where they loop around. We want them into the classrooms in an expeditious fashion. And so that's what we're hoping to do. Come into the classrooms, secure your devices. Teachers will be out in the hallways greeting students as they arrive. Again, those are some changes. Another significant change is that if a student then does not comply with the direction to have your devices secured, the teacher simply uses their school email and emails their school's help email. That is a change for almost all of our secondary schools. It is then the responsibility that help email goes to the main office as well as to designated employees. Once that happens, the teacher does nothing else. Then our engagement and intervention strategists, paraeducators, administrators will come and they'll take the device from the student. So we're trying to minimize sort of the policing the teachers have to do, minimize the disruption to the instructional flow, and then also put the onus more on the administrative team and the enforcement of the policy. That's a significant change, depending on the building you're in here right now. That's a significant change. Teachers that I talked to about that who aren't in a building that have that system thought that was a very good change. Okay, the devices that are held in the main office for the duration of the student's school day, with a variety of consequences depending on whether this is their first infraction or not. And that leads into our next slide with the infractions.
Yeah, absolutely. We talked through, that student noncompliance. While we know that there's going to be some growing pains that go along with this, and some students challenging the potential policy, we know that there's going to be some potential of this happening. So as we talk through what that rollout looks like, we know that there's going to have to be some response strategies. There's some protocols that we want our administrators to use when they are faced like this to ensure that there is some consistency with how that's handled. One of the things that we've had in conversations with other districts is really making sure that you have those types of conversations, because you know that you will be tasked with that type of thing. When you have teenagers in a building, you know that there's going to be provide some challenges to that. So we want to make sure that we start thinking through that with our administrators, whoever may encounter that, so they can have that their actions and their responses really detailed out for them, for not only themselves but the rest of the members of their team, so they're all dealing with it consistently.
That'll take some training. As you see when we talk about the timeline down toward the end of this, that is where there is probably going to need to be some consistency and some training that takes place across the different employee groups within the buildings.
Yep, and that was one of the things, like I said, we took back from from another district that worked through a policy this year, is really taking those times from when they decide on it to when they enact, going through that with their administrative team. So. Next, we talk through, again, we know that there's going to be some students who don't comply with our set policy, and what that progressive actions will be for our administrators and for our office staff. So we listed kind of what the offenses would look like for students. And I think it's important to note from the very beginning, even though it's listed there at the bottom, is we are not going to use office disciplinary referrals through Infinite Campus as a way to document the cell phone infractions. There's a building right now that's currently using a form that students fill out so they can kind of monitor the students' number of offenses that they have. And also at the very end, not kind of foreshadow what we have at the very end as some success metrics, is that's one of the things we're going to use to monitor the effectiveness of our policy, is those cell phone logs that are going to be used for students to have their infractions documented. So as you see there from the very beginning, from the first through the fifth offense, what really is detailed out through this is the responsibility of the student and then their family as part of those particular processes. So with the first offense, as Brady had mentioned, all these, the student would get their phone back at the end of the day. Having lived in a building where either the student couldn't pick it up or their family had to pick it up, that does provide challenges, and that automatically puts you on the defensive with some families at the time, because everybody's family schedule is a little bit different. So the importance of the student getting that phone back at the end of the day does inhibit us from fighting some of those battles with students and families. But we're really looking at that first offense and the second offense as really the impact and the conversations and the potential meetings that we have with families. Given those first initial offenses, giving the students the ownership, like, all right, you know what you did, and it really provides a great opportunity in the office. Kids probably not going to be happy, right, that they get their phone taken, and when they go and pick up their phone at the end of the day, it's probably not the greatest time to have a long, detailed conversation with them, but at least the fact that they're acknowledging what the cell phone is, what their part of breaking the policy was, and really what the ownership is the next day, what would happen if there's another offense of the cell phone policy. So as we go through there, again, a lot of it's on the students very at first, communicating with the family so they're aware of, it's been taken first, second particular time, the third time, fourth, and fifth, what that ownership then means on the families, whether it be them coming in for a meeting, or at the very last, fifth and future offenses, really creating a technology implementation plan for them with that student cell phone. And the good things about those conversations with families early on is to try to identify some of those barriers, and our buildings are having those right now with attendance. And there may be some things that are going on with a family of why a student has their cell phone out. And as we start to look through exemptions, those are things that are going to really be forthcoming with families during those particular meetings and those conversations that are having early on and often.
So a couple changes with that, set of consequences. One is, as highlighted by Lucas, it would be registered in a documentation log and not in Infinite Campus. That's a change for our campuses. And then the second thing that I do like that Lucas mentioned is the students have to sign and date the infraction law. I think that adds an element of ownership on behalf of the student that I think is going to be positive.
When we take a look at exemptions, and those of you that attended IASB a couple weeks ago maybe heard from a particular school about what they're using for a cell phone policy, and then I think it actually came out in the paper the very next day about a specific policy with the district and what they're using as exemptions. Was this in Kansas City or Kansas or Missouri or somewhere?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think where we found some of the examples that previous districts have used.
It's Kansas.
Because we know there will be some exemptions that we need to start to consider for students that have their cell phone for one reason or another. Things that are documented through a student's IEP or 504, whether it be for teacher, and this is one of the things that we talked about at this last meeting is, I've been in a number of different classrooms where a student or a teacher is using that particular cell phone for an instructional tool. Whether it be in a comp class and they're doing a video editing and the phone is the best resource for that, or as a scientific calculator or more advanced calculator than what the student or the teacher may have in the classroom. But with those exemptions, that's not just something that teachers are just going to do on their own. They need to get their approval from the administrator prior to that happening, so it's not just happening for, for something that may be able to be used as a tool or another resource in the building. And then again, we always need to consider those things that aren't necessarily documented through an official plan through 504 or IEP, excuse me, but something that's pre-approved by the communication between the family and the administrator with anything that may do with health concerns, whether it's the health of the student in the building, whether it be the health of maybe a family member that they're trying to be in close contact with, because we all know that those situations arise where somebody may be sick and they want to keep their family informed because a student, when they're concerned about the health or well-being of a family member, that's one thing that they constantly think throughout the day. So we want to give them the ability to have that resource close to them, and then it's the building's kind of obligation then is to tell those teachers, you may see your student, said student in your classroom with a phone. Let us give you the reasons why. So there may be some exemptions that are related to that.
I don't know. I don't think any of our current policies have this level of exemptions spelled out as well. So that'd be another change just based on the work that we're doing. Success metrics, and these are listed alphabetically, so we're not trying to prioritize one over the other. We're looking at a variety of metrics. Some of them I think we would recognize are going to be more directly related to the policy change, whatever that policy change happens to be. Cell phone documentation log entries, for instance, would be directly related to a cell phone policy change. We have hopes that grades and attendance will improve and bullying and harassment incidents would go down. I think we've all been around long enough to know those are going to be somewhat challenging to say that there's a causal factor that led to those, but that's our hope, is we would see increases in attendance rates and grades, and decreases in bullying and harassment, increases in library book checkouts. ODRs, or office disciplinary referrals, will be something that we, of course, track. You get that data, we'll be able to do that as well. And then I think there was a good shout out, maybe it was Charlie, I think Director Easton said we want some qualitative feedback, staff surveys. We want to engage the people who are implementing this, get their feedback, so we would certainly build that into a beginning part as well as an ending part.
All right, just kind of want to review what we foresee as an ideal timeline for after tonight, kind of our next steps moving forward. First and foremost, we want to make sure we inform if our students, families, and staff have not been following along with the work that's been done through these work sessions and previous meetings, is regularly making sure that we inform the families of what our policy would be. So that would start making sure that we start drafting that communication meeting tomorrow and ensuring that all of our families, staff members, and students are informed of the change in policies before we go into winter break. Next is the education piece. We know that this is could be potential big change for our staff and students. So really spending that time after the first part of the year when we return back for the 2025 calendar year is making sure that we educate our students and our staff about what their role within the new policy is. And again, if it's a large change or a small change in their building, what is the difference between what they were doing before and what will happen after. And then lastly is implementing. We chose the 21st of January, which is a Tuesday. That's after a 3-day weekend. So it's actually also the start of the third quarter for middle schools. So while there's no most ideal time to do this, we did figure that was the best time after winter break. Gives us time to educate, gives us time to work through potential things with our staff members, and then look to implement right after that 3-day weekend. So that's what we envision as the kind of optimal timeline and rollout plan for a policy change. That's what we have for you.
We've done a lot of Google searching on cell phones, so I'm just gonna tell you. And our search history is like, where did those, like, that's come from? Oh gosh, it was a state.
Yeah, and I think it's important to know, obviously, Iowa City is not the only school district looking into this, right? You know, there's other districts across that have implemented very similar ones, or maybe ones that are a little bit more, I should say, a little bit more extensive, looking at complete bans. But also it's conversation that's happening at the State House as well. So, you know, Governor Reynolds has commented on kind of her desire for cell phones, whether that she leaves that up to the districts or they do something and take it up at the legislature. So I think it's important to know that, you know, what we see is what works best for our district through the collaboration between our teachers and administrators. So
I'll open it up to directors. Go ahead.
I'm really interested in the role of the working group in establishing what she does. So can you make some comments about how you perceive the working group's support for what we have in front of us?
I think it crafted exactly what we see. I mean, the conversations weren't easy. They weren't just a rubber stamp for us to have conversations and we propose something to them, please approve it, here you go. Like, we had really good dialogue, and sometimes not necessarily heated, but we had really good dialogue between our nearly 20 people that were present. You know, they helped craft things that we weren't necessarily considering, things like examining the commons area and like the discussion about middle school study halls. What does that look like? Because that's not something we proposed to them. That was something that came up from the conversations between our groups. And you know, we left that last meeting 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, and everybody was in favor of what we're going to move forward with, and that they could not only support it, but then help with the work moving forward in their buildings.
Yeah, we facilitated work. I mean, I think really it was your directions and guardrails and, and then it was the work group that really produced the product.
The smartwatches, did we decide to remove that, or, because I was looking through the slides, I thought it was there before and now I can't see it. Did we decide to not allow them now, or are we still allowing the smartwatches?
Yeah, it was, we never actually had it. It was in the policy itself
Oh,
that
got it. Okay.
smartwatches would be allowed
Uh-huh.
unless it becomes a disruption to the classroom.
Okay,
We know that smartwatches, I've been looking around the table here, there's probably a number of different types of watches that are out there. Matt's looks different than mine, and what capabilities does Matt have that I don't? And what we don't want to have then teachers in the room like, can that be used for texting? Like, we just don't want that as an additional thing that teachers have to confront.
I see, so that's the reasoning. Okay,
Yeah.
that was my one concern.
And it's
I
also-
think that makes sense,
yeah.
yeah.
And we had conversations too, like, where does it stop with smartwatches? Then do we need to start looking specifically at things like Kindles, iPads,
Yeah.
other things that exist for communication? So we just don't want to get pigeonholed into, like, do we say this, and then when this comes up, do we need to add this, this, and this? The more we start to get involved, the more things we make out that or
Yeah. One thing I think that's a great question. It is in the existing policy language, although not on the slideshow. I think one possibility when we seek feedback from staff would be to include a question specifically about other types of devices. Once we implement this, what are they seeing, happening? Are students gravitating toward other devices, be it their school issue Chromebook or smartwatches or all the names of the things that they brought up that I don't know of. But I think that's great. I mean, I do think we would need to monitor that because there will be consequences of any policy. There's consequences, both intended and unintended. And so that might be an unintended consequence that we have to then, circle back to and say, okay, we're implementing this. We're getting feedback from people in the classrooms, and we need to adjust.
So are we thinking that part of that inform message will have some type of language in there for staff and or parents and guardians about the exceptions or exemptions on how do a teacher get an exemption to be able to allow cell phones for educational purposes in their classrooms?
Yes, I think is the short answer. I think it's also, again, the reason why I want to give this timeline is to allow the conversations to be had between the teachers and the administrators. Like, what may you be using the cell phone in your classroom? Like, is it essential that the cell phone be used for it? Sometimes it identifies some things that you need resources for in your classroom that you don't currently have. So you might identify those as part of those conversations. But yes, I think what you had mentioned, President Malone, is making sure that we communicate that through how we inform. It also kind of re-educates our families too, because some of our families have become so ingrained on all I need to do is send my child a text message, and they get the message about either to pick a sibling up after school or hey, don't forget this or forget that for the evening. You know, we're looking at a class period of 45 to 50 minutes. You know, if a message can't wait 45 to 50 minutes, re-educating our families, the best way to get a hold of your student then is to contact the main office. And it's just going through those steps again that we we worried about 15 to 20 years ago before cell phones about how do we get in touch with our student before cell phones existed.
The consequence structure has the verbal warning by the teacher at the beginning and then no other grace or warning. I know some of our schools are using the pocket idea, which is if you see the phone after the warning goes in the pocket first before the office is called. Did the working group consider the pockets? And if so, what kind of factors went into why that wasn't the ultimate decision in the policy?
Yeah, that's a good question. So some schools are using now a system where they have the teacher deliver a warning and then an additional redirection by the teacher that leads to the cell phone going into a hanging pouch in their classroom. The working group did talk about that, and I think the concern that the working group had, and which is why it didn't make the final cut, so to speak, is that interaction was both sort of a distraction and a disruption to the learning process and a potential power struggle between the teacher and the student, rather than simply saying in the beginning, your devices should be secured, and then trusting that the students understand what that means and using the help email of the school as a redirection device. I think that's why the work group didn't land there. They did talk about it a little bit. They did want, I think some teachers have used the pouches successfully, and so they did want a role for that, and that could be in the very beginning. If a student feels like, yep, that's the best place for my device to go because I know I struggle with self-control, then they still have the pouch, they can put it right in there. But I think it was the desire to avoid a power struggle and disruptions to learning that led the work group to say, we're going to go a different direction.
And I think that's the difference also between being proactive, like Brady had mentioned, a student like, I know if I have it near me, I'm going to check it. So I'm going to use that when I walk in the room. That's going to be my procedure and protocol when I come in. But a lot of the times it's being used as reactive. And we talked about there could be one student that, again, the teacher gives them warning, then they see it out again, go put it in the pouch. And that could happen 7 times a day. And then just happens the next day and the next day. And are we really enforcing what we want for an expectation? So that's why we wanted to be consistent with that the warning is delivered when the teacher enters the room, and in the moment it's out, we start to go through our list of responses.
I have a question on the high school, the open periods, and using it in designated areas is what it said there.
Yep.
Is that the designated areas being decided on a school-by-school basis? And is there, how are we going to ensure that that's, clear? Will there be a sign that says this is the cell phone okay place?
And there's some buildings that have that currently.
Yeah.
When you go in the commons area, they have a cell phone, what is that? I can't remember how it's worded.
We have a green in our classroom. I think there will be some signage. I do think there's going to be some training of students and some work with students and staff. I think there would be some simple signage that would exist. We have them in our classrooms, or have had them. There's one side is red, device is secured, and the other side is green, and it says something, which I don't know because I never have that side up, but they do have things, and I think you see the same thing. I think that the buildings call different spaces different things, which is why we went with designated areas. We tried to pin them down a little bit more. This is where they did have a role in writing the policies. They call them different spaces, or they call what I would think are comparable spaces different names. So I think that will be identified.
I think that becomes part of the education piece, because if it's, I left class and now I have an open period and I know that I can have it in my open period, I might start now as I'm traveling around, or maybe I take a little bit longer to get to wherever I'm going to go, get outside the zone of...
100%. The policy does say that hallways cannot be designated areas for that purpose. But I would say, I think that PBIS teams are going to also have to think about ways to reinforce some positive behaviors. And we certainly did do that in all of our schools. Like, what does it look like to be, to belong, to have ownership and leadership in a hallway? And I think we've moved away from that concept a little bit in PBIS, so specific spaces. But I think there is a role, for teaching some positive expectations about some of these spaces that.
And Brady mentioned PBS, and one of the big things they do at the beginning of the year, common area expectations about what's appropriate in certain areas of the building and how do we act responsibly as a student within those. And we always encourage our staff members at the beginning, like when we come back from break, without being back in school for 2 to 3 weeks, that's always a good idea to review those expectations. So this would be one of the things that would be included in reviewing now what would be a new expectation.
I have one other question. This might require you to pull out a crystal ball, right? Because I'm wondering, because we have had some feedback from parents, right? With either emails to us or solicited stuff. When your progressive discipline involves getting the parents in it, do we feel like we have the support of the parents with this policy? Because if the answer is no, that's meaningless to have that as part of your progressive structure, right?
Yeah.
So do we feel pretty good about the parental support for this?
And I think-
Generally, I know there's going to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say exactly, but we do know, as buildings have already encountered, they may not agree with their current building policy that they have in place, and they say, my student's gonna have their cell phone regardless whether you say they should or not. So they're already encountering those conversations, but I think one of the important things is, at our 8 campuses, we need to make sure we have a standard response protocol. Rather than going from A all the way to Z, being the most extreme, like how can we work through what we would normally consider very restorative practices within this, making sure that we give the student and their family every opportunity. And again, families may not agree with it, but it is the policy that we have in place in our building. And it's a really easy way to get around this policy. You just don't have your phone on. So we're not telling them they can't have their phone, but there are certain things we have to abide by, given what we've seen as essential for our district.
Yeah, the administrators in the work group talked about that issue extensively and sort of shared their experiences. And, they've been varied, just as you would expect, within your campus and across campuses. But that was something that the idea of having uniform response, that's the strength in that, the importance of it, I think was heard loud and clear.
Because we know that coming to get a phone could turn into what were looked at as an infraction of the cell phone policy, now turns into something extreme. So we want to make sure that our administrators are, we start to think through those right now so they know what their response is going to be and how they can address that as a team.
And our parents are great partners. I mean, they always respond well to progressive discipline. And, I think that certainly takes place with this one, that the student first has a couple opportunities to fix it on their own. Then if it's not fixed, the parent's contacted. And then we need to take the additional step of meeting with the parents. And so it's not like a 0 to 100 approach. There's an opportunity there. And so I think, again, the parents will be clear on what those steps are and what the expectations are there. And then when we, need their support, I think we have a good track record of how we work with parents, whether it's this type of a situation or, another discipline situation and how they want to be involved. So.
For comparison's sake, at the presentation at the school board convention this year, the 3 districts that presented on that had only 3 steps, not 5, and the parents were involved at step 2, not step 3. So I think we're giving a couple chances before that. So I think that's good.
That's interesting. Yeah.
One thing we haven't talked about with the education stage, and I think Director Williams had kind of brought this up last time, would also be with our elementaries. Our cell phones currently aren't allowed at the elementary building. We know kids still present with them, again, younger and younger, it seems that way. But I think we have an opportunity here to also reset that expectation, to remind folks that, they're not allowed at the elementary, that if you need to contact your student through the school day, that's what our office is for. With some smaller campuses, of course, navigating, getting messages to students and things is much more workable for our staff in that regard too. So there's no concern about them calling into the office and us funneling messages to students. So I think during that education phase, it's not only the implementation of this, it's the reminder of the elementary policy that doesn't, allow for the phones to be out during the day. And we will certainly emphasize that when we send out some of this communication too. I don't think we've decided yet if that's one whole district message or if that's tailored towards elementary versus secondary, but that will be a piece we work on in that education stage too.
2 things. So I'll start with the first one. what do you see as defined as instructional time? Because that was one of the hangups that I had coming across the policy. Because, yeah, instructional time is it group work? Is it the moment that the student, the first bell rings at the beginning of the class, ends the class? Do you define that in some way, shape, or form?
Yes, sir, thank you for that question. It's a great question. Sorry for interrupting. The definition that we use for this policy proposal is, for the purposes of this policy, instructional time is defined as the time between the tardy bell that starts each class period and the dismissal bell that ends the class period. So it's literally, bell to bell.
Yeah, we didn't want to get into what does instruction look like. Is it only when the teacher's up in the front of the room? If the students are working independently, can they work on it? No.
They did their work and they're doing the extension. Is that instructional now to this extent? We just said tardy bell, dismissal bell.
And the second part is going to be as I've already voiced to Superintendent Degner, the sticking point for me on this is the smartwatch, because it's not really a watch. It is, for all intents and purposes, for the majority that you see out there, it's a communication device that goes around the wrist. And it's just, first off, students that can afford the smartwatch or parents who can afford the smartwatch, they get the communication device. Other students in the room, they don't get the communication device throughout the day. And if there was a change to the policy, maybe turn off the cell phone, because as soon as, if that Bluetooth link is there, those students are still going to get those, on average, 54 push notifications throughout a class period, or not a class period, but throughout the school day, of what is going on in their lives, or whatever it is, to distract. And I'll say it again at the main meeting, but I wanted to let it be known here so it doesn't catch anybody off guard when we get to it.
Yeah.
I think one of our responses on that would be, I agree with you, Director Lingo, about how watches are used, but in the past when we've implemented things, some of the things that we've seen happen that have maybe tripped us up is when we try to take too large of steps at the beginning. And so, not saying that we couldn't get there with the smartwatches, but doing it incrementally as we introduce it one device at a time, kind of like Brady and Lucas talked about, we think is going to help us be established for more long-term sustainable success. And so I don't think anybody disagrees with that notion that they are used for communication. It's just as we look to step into this with the education, especially as such a new concept for us, making sure we do it in a way that we set up our teachers for success, our students and our families for success, we think is a better approach rather than trying to tackle potentially the whole broader issue all at one time.
If I recall correctly, some of the feedback that we got from our students with the survey was that they felt that the current policies were inconsistently enforced by teachers. How are we going to ensure that our teachers implement any plan or policy with fidelity?
That's a great question.
It's a great question. I think there has to be shared responsibility and accountability on that. I do. I think the training part, we look at the timeline, I think there's going to be an education and training component. I think your administrators are going to have a role, and I would say this as, with my role in ICEA, that teachers should be held accountable to a policy, be it this policy or another policy, for implementing it. If they're unable to, there needs to be a discussion about why they're facing barriers that make it so they are unable to implement a policy. But I think that's going to be important. I do. It's not, we can create any number of policies, and unless we're implementing them with fidelity or a great or high level of fidelity, the policy is not destined for long-term success. And so I think that's just work we're going to have to do, with staff, and I think that's up and down the line. It could be administrators as they are enforcing the policy and following through with the consequences. I think there's just going to have to be mutual accountability toward one another, knowing the importance of the topic and the priority the board's placed on it.
I think it's more clear and it's easier for the teachers to do what they're supposed to do, and if it's easier, I think it will be a little more consistent.
No, I mean, that's what I hope, but I also could see teachers saying, I don't want to take the time to send the email. And again, and then not enforcing the policy. And so I wonder if we're going to do Qualtrics surveys, if we can also maybe include surveys to the students as well, and see if they think that's. And I also wonder if someone at the building admin team is going to keep their eye on the number of violation reports by teacher, right? If if you have 30 teachers in a building and 28 of them all average about 5 violations or 10 violations a week, but then 2 never have a violation, I would think that that might send a message that perhaps, I mean, maybe the kids are on their very best behavior and perfect in those classrooms, or maybe we have some issues with fidelity to the policy.
I think that's something that, yeah, administrators just do.
Yeah.
I mean, regardless, like, that never give Fs, or that
Yeah.
don't have students that earn Fs, or whatever it is. I mean, I think that's, yeah, it's an important piece that I think the administrators may watch.
Well, I think your point goes back to something that Director Eastham said earlier too about the work group. Brady and Lucas did a tremendous job facilitating it, but the amount of collaboration across the buildings on something to look at a uniform policy across all our buildings was paramount to bring this forward, but then also will be important to what you're talking about. So it's not just about the teacher down the hall, because we know people have friends, relatives that work in other buildings. And so how are we communicating as a leadership team for that consistency? And Lucas and Brady have already did a nice job getting that conversation started. And so that'll be an important part of that too, as well, Lisa, is just making sure the administrators are talking to each other about what are they seeing and then comparing that data so they can adjust and make those modifications they need to with that enforcement.
Another question, do we anticipate changes to our staff policy in the employee handbook, and that's more of a Chase Nick question about their own use of?
We were having the same discussion. I think part of it is what's going to be the expectation for kids. So once we kind of move forward with this, then having some conversation about what's the expectation for our adults in the building too. And in that case, not just teachers. I mean, I think some of the ones that we'd be thinking about, some of the support staff that are in our classrooms and different things. So, because we need to be modeling those behaviors as well. I think that's going to be hard for a student to be told to have their phone away and then they see an adult, over in the other part of the room doing whatever. So that's something we have to look through.
And we'll want to take a similar approach, work with Brady, bring in some of our rep council from our different employee groups. I mean, we're doing that for our students. We want to respect our staff members and get their voice in that as well, understanding where we are, where we want to go, but we definitely would want to have them in that conversation as we work on those guidelines.
And then finally, I just want to circle back to our elementary buildings and really hope that we can continue, once this policy gets resolved, however it gets resolved, look at that elementary school, because I don't think it's a ban. Well, I know it's not, because I pulled up the policy while you were talking. And we allow the cell phones in our elementary
But
buildings.
they're not supposed to be out. They can come with them, but.
Right.
Yeah.
And it says students may use personal devices while school is in session when permission is given and under the direct supervision of school staff member. And so I would just really like us to workshop, like, is that necessary? When and if it's necessary, does it fall better under an exemption so that the policy is no cell phones are allowed in our elementary schools. However, here are the times that they're allowed, and if you need to use your cell phone, you get an exemption. And instead of sending the message, which is the message that our parents have now, that you can send your child to school with a cell phone as long as they're not using it during the day. And I think if we really tightened up this elementary school policy and said phones don't have a place in school, that's setting the culture for these kids' experience as they move on, and it'll make the transition easier when they get to middle school and high school.
Yeah, a couple of things, three actually, on the elementary policies. First of all, it was written 3 years ago. We know that society has changed significantly in those 3 years. And we also don't have our sixth graders in that setting, which is, we know our older students were the ones that were more inclined to have a phone, so we certainly can review it. The piece around this direct supervision of the teacher was getting to that second bullet in that policy around like the approved educational purposes. However, again, without our sixth graders, we're finding fewer and fewer needs for that. And that last piece is we will use that exact same verbiage about the exemption, because that is a piece that we did not have. And we do know that we have elementary age students that use a cell phone-like device to manage like diabetes, for example. And so we want to make sure that that language was exactly the same. So we will look at that alignment. Once the policy for secondary is approved, we'll look at where those pieces need to be aligned.
Because in
in our elementary
practice,
setting.
as I'm sure anyone who has any contact with an elementary school knows, in practice what's happening is kids are bringing their devices, it's not so much an issue during the class time, but then they get out on recess and their teacher's not around and there's not as much
Right.
supervision and the phones are being used there and there's bullying. I mean, there's all these things happening that it just seems,
I think that's what I was trying to say, Director Williams, is it's not that they're not allowed to bring them currently, it's the expectation that they shouldn't be out, right? But you're highlighting a couple places where we're not as consistent as we could be or should be. We haven't taken the step to say you can't send your kid to school with the phone, or that if we see a phone, we're gonna confiscate it. So I think there's some cleanup we could do. And then again, just like any of this, I mean, this is all an iterative process, right? So we're gonna learn something, probably gonna come back and talk about it and see what else we need to adjust or tighten down or recommend as next steps. It could be informed by what the team shared about the legislative session. If we get a law from the state of Iowa that, causes us to have to rethink what our current policy is to make sure we're in compliance with that. But I think it's a good, solid place for us to start. It's taken a lot of collaboration. It's taken into consideration a lot of input from you guys, a lot of input from the community. And I think we had a really high level work group that left feeling pretty good about a clean process. And that's the way I would describe it. It's really clean about what the steps to be taken are. It's easy to execute if you're a teacher. That lift is not very high on what you need to do. And it's also predictable for the kids. I mean, the kids, it's very clear about if this happens, this is going to be our response. And now it's up to us as the adults to make sure, we follow through in a predictable fashion to create that environment that we're looking for.
I'm sorry, Director Williams, are you done?
I'm done now. Thank you, Charlie.
The piece that's missing for me in this presentation right now is that there's not an assessment timeline. That, to me, that would be very helpful, and I'm not sure about the rest of the board, if that could be incorporated as we go forward here. I'm not suggesting that it goes into the law or vote on tonight.
Well, I think something we could throw out as an example, Charlie, if this starts at the beginning of a third quarter, we could look at the end of the third quarter, for a data set from there. And so that basically gives us a quarter of the year with this policy. We could consider, any recommended adjustments for the fourth quarter or then for the start of the next school year. But if we took that 9-week time frame and kind of looked at that stretch, something smaller than that is probably going to be hard to take data, turn it around, have a meaningful conversation with you guys and do something about it. So that would give us a stretch of time to implement. So that would be one proposal we could throw out.
There's one other metric that I'd be curious about, and I wouldn't add it as a measure of success, but I would just be curious to know if it affected the number of visits to the health office for anxiety and depression, for example.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
And one thing that could be a problem in the data is that it's a national followed trend, but there's always a mental health spike after the Christmas break. So I don't know how that would factor into any sort of data.
We'd have to try to look at comparisons to maybe last year, what we could grab. So, yep.
One of the things,
Two more minutes before.
one of the things that Matt had mentioned at the very beginning is what you see like as an ideal way to introduce this as an action item with the board meeting. So I'm curious from your guys' lens, what would be important prior to you taking a vote for this tonight to say little, say a lot, so kind of at the call for you.
For me, looking at the agenda, it's not very heavy. I wouldn't be opposed for you to run through your presentation. I'm sorry. But it's good to put it on video because, as I've said back here, oftentimes it's hard to listen to these meetings without the visual. So if you ran through, I wouldn't be opposed to that. I don't know what. Okay, I'm seeing some agreement.
I would just give a suggestion of, you could probably be a little more brief of how we got here,
Yeah.
the history of it, because people are gonna be like, what is the
Right.
policy? That's gonna be the main
Yeah.
focus.
And
So
the
that's where I would spend most of the time.
Yes. So thank you for
I'm
being willing to
interested
do that.
in making sure the public understands, understand that this is based upon a work group that exemplifies
Yes.
teaching and administrative approaches that are involved.
Do we have some agreement on that 9-week stretch then? That's kind of what we'll do for a time period? Okay, good.
And with that, again, I'll be on that action item, and before we go for a vote, we'll have them present, we'll do a discussion, then vote. And is there a motion to adjourn? All those in favor? Aye. All right, see you at the table at 6.